Hello, family. Today we're talking about something that many of you have lived through but didn't have the language for. Being nice won't change a narcissist, but this will. Some of you were taught that kindness fixes everything, that if you just love harder, stay calmer, give more chances, explain yourself better, pray longer, tolerate more, eventually they'll wake up and realize your value. But what if I told you that your niceness is not transforming them, it's training them? What if the very thing you thought would heal the relationship is actually feeding the dysfunction? This message is not about becoming cruel. It's not about revenge. It's about clarity, because you cannot heal what you keep enabling, and you cannot change someone who benefits from staying the same. Niceness feels good. It feels righteous. It feels like the higher road. You tell yourself, I'm just being mature. I'm just being patient. I'm just choosing peace. But here's the uncomfortable truth. When niceness has no boundaries, it stops being kindness and starts becoming permission. Permission for disrespect. Permission for manipulation. Permission for emotional chaos. A narcissistic personality doesn't interpret endless kindness the way a healthy person does. A healthy person sees grace and feels gratitude. A narcissist sees grace and feels opportunity. They don't think, wow, they love me so much. They think, wow, I can get away with this again. And that's not because you're weak. It's because you were trained to believe that enduring pain makes you virtuous. You confuse tolerance with strength. You think absorbing the impact makes you the bigger person. But what it really does is teach them that your limits are flexible. When you explain yourself 10 different ways after they twist your words, you're not resolving conflict. You're teaching them that distortion works. When you forgive without changed behavior, you're not showing compassion. You're showing that consequences are optional. When you stay silent after disrespect just to keep the peace, you're not being peaceful. You're being conditioned. Boundaries are not about controlling someone else's behavior. They are about defining what access costs. And when access to you is free, it is rarely valued. If every time they cross a line you respond with more understanding, more patience, more emotional labor, they learn something very clearly: crossing lines doesn't cost them anything. That's the pattern. Niceness without boundaries communicates, I will adjust. Boundaries communicate, I will not. A narcissist does not change because you're kind. They change when their strategy stops working. And as long as your niceness cushions the consequences of their behavior, their strategy is working perfectly. You see, manipulation thrives in environments where confrontation is avoided. If every issue turns into you over-explaining instead of them self-reflecting, the imbalance grows. If every argument ends with you apologizing just to move forward, the power dynamic becomes clear. They push, you bend, they escalate, you accommodate. Over time, you don't even recognize yourself anymore because you started out being kind. But somewhere along the way, you became compliant. Somewhere along the way, your voice got softer. Your standards got lower. Your expectations got smaller. Not because you didn't have them, but because you were afraid that enforcing them would make you difficult. Let me tell you something clearly. Boundaries do not make you difficult. They make you defined. When you say, I will not accept being spoken to that way, and you follow through by removing yourself from the conversation, that's not cruelty. That's clarity. When you say, if this behavior continues, I will distance myself, and you actually create distance, that's not punishment. That's alignment. The shift happens when you stop asking, how can I get them to understand? And start asking, why am I working so hard to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding me? Niceness keeps you in negotiation mode. Boundaries move you into decision mode. And narcissistic dynamics cannot survive where decisions replace negotiations. The moment your kindness is paired with firmness, the dynamic changes. The moment your grace has structure, the manipulation weakens. Because now there is something they cannot charm, guilt, or gaslight their way around. Structure. You don't have to become cold. You don't have to become harsh. You simply have to become consistent. Consistency is what turns boundaries from words into reality, and reality is what forces truth to surface. One of the most exhausting roles you will ever play is trying to be the emotional doctor for someone who refuses to admit they're sick. You analyze their childhood. You empathize with their trauma. You excuse their anger. You tell yourself, they act like this because they're hurting. And maybe that's true. But pain explains behavior. It does not excuse it. And it certainly does not obligate you to endure it. Here is the trap: when you see their wounds, you feel compassion. When you feel compassion, you try to help. When you try to help, you overextend. And when you overextend, you slowly abandon yourself. A narcissistic mindset survives on denial. Not just denial of wrongdoing, but denial of vulnerability. To admit they are wounded would require accountability. It would require self-reflection. It would require sitting with shame instead of projecting it. And that is the very thing they avoid at all costs. So instead of saying, I was wrong, they say, you're too sensitive. Instead of saying, I hurt you, they say, you misunderstood me. Instead of saying, I need help, they say, you're the problem. And because you are empathetic, you begin to question your own perception. You think, maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I did misunderstand. You twist yourself into emotional knots trying to solve a puzzle that keeps changing shape. But healing only works when someone acknowledges the wound. You cannot stitch up what someone insists isn't bleeding. You cannot rebuild what someone refuses to admit is broken. When a person denies their issues, your attempts to help start looking like attacks to them. Your concern feels like criticism. Your boundaries feel like betrayal. Your honesty feels like disrespect. Because in their mind, the problem is never internal. It is always external. And if the problem is always external, then you will always be part of it. This is where many strong, loving people get stuck. You think your love can model stability. You think your patience can inspire growth. You think if you just stay steady enough, kind enough, wise enough, they'll eventually soften. But growth does not come from exposure to your maturity. It comes from ownership of their immaturity. You are not responsible for dragging someone into self-awareness. That is work they must choose. And if they are committed to protecting their ego more than protecting the relationship, your healing energy becomes fuel for their avoidance. You start carrying emotional weight that was never yours. You start managing their moods, anticipating their triggers, softening your tone, shrinking your needs. You call it support. But slowly, it becomes self-erasure. And here's the reality. The more you try to rescue someone from themselves, the more they resist you. Because rescue implies weakness, and a narcissistic ego cannot tolerate weakness. They would rather destroy the relationship than admit they need help. So the shift is not in trying harder. The shift is in stepping back, in recognizing that compassion without reciprocity becomes depletion, in understanding that you can care about someone and still accept that they are unwilling to do the work. You cannot love someone into accountability. You cannot sacrifice someone into self-awareness. You cannot bleed enough to make them value your pain. Healing requires humility, and humility cannot be forced. The moment you accept that their denial is a choice, not a misunderstanding, your perspective changes. You stop personalizing their deflection. You stop internalizing their projections. You stop trying to decode every reaction as if the right combination of words will unlock transformation. Because transformation is not a code, it's a decision. And until they decide to confront themselves, nothing you offer will be enough. Not your loyalty, not your forgiveness, not your explanations. At some point, you have to ask yourself whether you are staying because you believe they will heal, or because you believe you can heal them. One of those beliefs is rooted in hope. The other is rooted in control disguised as compassion. Let them face the consequences of their own denial. Let them experience the discomfort they keep outsourcing onto you. Let them sit with the silence that comes when you stop over-functioning in a dynamic that requires two emotionally responsible adults. If you've ever walked away from an argument feeling drained, confused, and somehow blamed for everything, you've experienced this dynamic. The goal was never resolution. The goal was reaction. Healthy conflict seeks understanding. It moves toward clarity. It might get intense, but it eventually circles back to accountability and repair. Narcissistic conflict works differently. It escalates, it provokes, it pokes at insecurities, it rewrites history. And when you finally react, when your voice shakes, when your tone sharpens, when your tears fall, that moment becomes the evidence they were waiting for. Because reaction is the fuel. When you react emotionally, the focus shifts, the original issue disappears. Now the conversation becomes about your tone, your attitude, your overreaction. What started as you addressing disrespect turns into you defending your response to disrespect. And somehow the person who caused the harm becomes the one demanding an apology. That's not miscommunication, that's strategy. A narcissistic personality thrives on emotional supply. Attention, anger, tears, long explanations, defensive speeches. It all feeds the same need. It reassures them that they still have influence over your emotional state. If they can provoke you, they can control the atmosphere. And control is the real objective. This is why calm conversations often feel impossible. The The moment things start getting too grounded, too logical, too direct, the tactics shift. They interrupt, they deflect, they bring up something from 6 months ago, they question your memory, they laugh at your concern. Anything to spark emotion, because emotion keeps you engaged. Resolution would require responsibility. Reaction only requires stimulation. And you, being emotionally intelligent, walk into the conversation thinking clarity is the goal. You think, if I just explain it clearly enough, they'll understand. So you prepare your points, you soften your delivery, you try to stay composed. But the more composed you are, the more they push. Until finally you break. And that breaking point becomes their proof. See, you're unstable. See, you're dramatic. See, this is why I can't talk to you. The original issue is gone. The disrespect is buried. Now you're apologizing for being hurt. The power shift happens when you stop supplying reaction, not silence filled with resentment, not passive-aggressive distance, but regulated detachment. When you respond instead of react, the dynamic weakens. When you refuse to chase every accusation, defend every distortion, or correct every exaggeration, something changes. The conversation loses its oxygen. A narcissistic dynamic depends on escalation. It depends on you fighting to be heard. It depends on you caring so much about being understood that you over-explain yourself into exhaustion. But when you calmly say, "I'm not going to argue about that," and mean it, when you disengage instead of proving, when you let a false accusation sit without scrambling to dismantle it, you remove the reward. And without reward, the behavior becomes less satisfying. This doesn't mean you suppress your feelings. It means you protect them. It means you recognize when a conversation is no longer productive and you choose not to participate in your own emotional ambush. You start asking different questions. Not, how do I win this argument? But, why am I trying to win something that keeps costing me peace? Not, how do I make them see my side? But why do I need validation from someone committed to misunderstanding me? The moment you stop reacting, the mask starts slipping. Because now they have to sit with their own words. Now there's no explosion to point at, no dramatic response to deflect toward. Just their behavior exposed in stillness. And stillness is uncomfortable for someone who relies on chaos. Your calm becomes confusing. Your boundaries become boring. Your disengagement becomes threatening. Not because you're attacking, but because you're no longer feeding the cycle. Reaction keeps you trapped. Resolution requires two willing people. And when only one person is willing, the most powerful move is not louder emotion, it's controlled withdrawal. When you master your response, you take back your power.